Montana, 1889. Levi Hartwell had been forbidden from setting foot on Doyle land since before he could walk, and he had kept to that rule for 26 years, right up until the morning he found Josephine Doyle standing waist-deep in Miller's Creek with a drowning calf in her arms, and a look on her face that told him the fence line between their families had never once mattered less. "Don't just stand there," she said, water soaking through her sleeves, the calf thrashing weakly against her grip. "Get in the water." Levi Hartwell, who had been raised on a hatred so old that neither he nor Josephine Doyle could name the exact year it started, waded into a creek that had been the subject of a 20-year war between their two families, and helped a Doyle pull a calf out of the current, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man doing the thing his father had forbidden, that something in him had just changed permanently. They got the calf onto the bank. It coughed, staggered, and stood, and Josephine let out a breath that had been held the whole time, and looked at Levi across the wet grass with an expression that had nothing to do with the 20 years behind them, and everything to do with the next 30 seconds. "You're a Hartwell," she said, not a question, a fact she was still absorbing. "You're a Doyle," he said. "I noticed the same thing about you." She almost laughed. She caught it before it fully arrived, the way a person catches something they're not sure they're allowed to feel yet, and Levi watched her catch it, and thought that he had never in his life wanted to see anything as badly as he wanted to see her let it go. The feud had started, as these things generally do, over something that had seemed enormous at the time and had gotten larger with every year that nobody bothered to make it smaller. Miller's Creek ran the boundary between the Hartwell spread and the Doyle spread, 4 miles of water that both families depended on, and in the drought summer of 1869, with the creek running thin and both herds thirsty, Josephine's grandfather, Patrick Doyle, had built a small diversion dam on his side, upstream, to pool enough water for his own cattle. He had not asked permission. He had not, by his own later account, thought he needed to, since the water crossed his land first before it reached the Hartwell side. Levi's grandfather, Amos Hartwell, had lost 11 head of cattle to the dry stretch that followed, and had ridden onto Doyle land with a shotgun and torn the dam apart with his bare hands while Patrick Doyle watched from his porch with a rifle he chose, in the end, not to use. Nobody had been shot. Nobody had been seriously hurt, not that summer. But something had broken that year that never fully mended, and the two families had spent the next 20 years passing the injury down through their children like a family Bible, each generation adding its own grievance on top of the original one, until neither the Hartwells nor the Doyles entirely remembered which specific offense they were currently angry about, only that they were, and always had been, and presumably always would be. Levi's father, Thomas Hartwell, had grown up hearing the story of the torn-down dam so many times it had become scripture. Josephine's father, Michael Doyle, had grown up hearing the story of the shotgun on the porch with the same reverence. Both men had inherited the feud the way they'd inherited their land, without ever choosing it, and both had raised their children inside its boundaries with the assumption that the boundaries were simply how the world was arranged. Levi Hartwell was 26 years old and had never spoken more than 10 words to a Doyle in his life before the morning at the creek. He knew Josephine Doyle existed the way you know a mountain exists on the other side of a valley, visible, permanent, understood to be there, and never once approached. He had seen her at a distance at the county fair 3 years running. He had heard, from men who worked both spreads and occasionally crossed paths at the feed store in town, that she ran half the Doyle operation herself and ran it well. Better, some said quietly, than her father had at the same age. Josephine Doyle was 23, capable in the way a person becomes capable when a family depends on them being so, and she had grown up under the same inherited certainty that Levi had, that Hartwells were the reason the Doyles had spent 2 decades fighting for water that should have been plentiful, that the family across the creek was simply, permanently, the enemy, in the unquestioned way a child accepts weather. Neither of them had asked to inherit any of it, Both of them had, until the calf went into the creek, never once considered that they might be allowed to put it down. The calf belonged to neither family. That was the detail that would matter later, when Josephine tried to explain to her father exactly how she had come to be standing in Miller's Creek with a Hartwell. It had wandered off from a small, independent operation, 2 properties over, spooked loose in a storm 2 days before, and had gotten itself stuck in a deep pool on the creek's Doyle-facing bank at the exact moment Levi happened to be riding the fence line on his side, close enough to hear it bawling. He had not thought about whose land the creek technically belonged to. He had thought about a drowning animal, and he had gone in without deciding to, the way you sometimes do the right thing before your training has time to argue you out of it. Afterward, standing on the bank with the calf recovering between them, Levi understood he had a choice to make that had nothing to do with the animal at all. "I should go," he said, "before somebody sees a Hartwell on this side of the water." "Probably," Josephine agreed. Neither of them moved. "My father would have a great deal to say about it," Levi said. "So would mine," Josephine said. "He'd say considerably more than my father, honestly. Yours, at least, has the dignity of being consistent about it." Levi looked at her, surprised into something that was almost a laugh. "You've got opinions about my father." "I've got opinions about the whole arrangement," Josephine said. "I've had them for years. I've simply never had anyone to say them to who'd understand what I meant." She looked at the calf, now standing shakily and beginning to graze, as though nothing had happened to it at all. "That's the trouble with a feud that's older than either of us. Nobody left alive actually remembers deciding to have it. We just showed up already in the middle of it." Levi was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "I've never thought about it that way." "Most people don't," Josephine said. "Thinking about it that way is inconvenient." She looked at him directly, water still dripping from her sleeves, and something in her expression shifted from wary to genuinely curious. "You waded into the creek for a calf that isn't even yours. So did you." "I'm on my own land," she said. "You crossed a line that's gotten men in this valley shot at, over an animal that belongs to neither of us." She studied him. "Why?" Levi thought about it honestly, because he found, standing there, that he did not especially want to give her a careless answer. "Because it was drowning," he said, "and because I got tired, somewhere around the time I hit the water, of a rule I never remember agreeing to." Josephine looked at him for a long moment. The creek moved between them, indifferent to 20 years of history, doing what it had always done. "I'd like to talk to you again," she said, plainly, the way she seemed to say most things, "somewhere that isn't likely to get either of us shot at." They began meeting at the old line shack, a half-collapsed structure built decades before by neither family, standing on a strip of unclaimed government land that ran between the 2 properties like a seam nobody had bothered to stitch. Neither of them announced this arrangement to the other, exactly. Levi simply mentioned, the second time they met at the creek by accident on purpose, that the shack was there, and Josephine said she knew it, and the third meeting happened at the shack without either of them formally proposing it. The shack itself became, over those weeks, a kind of neutral country neither family had ever claimed, and both had somehow forgotten existed. Josephine brought a blanket the second week, folded in her saddlebag like it was nothing in particular. Levi brought coffee the third, a small tin pot he'd taken from his own kitchen without explaining to anyone why, and they sat on the packed dirt floor drinking coffee that neither of them would have admitted, if pressed, tasted like very much at all, because neither of them was there for the coffee. They talked about the creek and the cattle and the particular unfairness of inheriting a war neither of them had voted for. Josephine told him about running the Doyle books since she was 17, about a father who trusted her with everything except the freedom to question the feud itself. Levi told her about his own father's silences, the way Thomas Hartwell would go quiet for entire meals if a Doyle's name came up, the way Levi had learned as a boy that the surest way to disappoint his father was to ask, even once, whether the whole thing might have gone differently. "My grandfather tore a dam apart with his bare hands," Levi said, one evening in the shack with the lamp turned low. I've heard the story so many times I could tell it myself, word for word, the way he told it. But nobody ever tells the part where your grandfather built the dam because his herd was dying too. Nobody ever mentions that part had a reason behind it. Nobody ever mentions on our side that your grandfather didn't fire the gun he could have fired, Josephine said. Or that Amos Hartwell rode home that night and, according to my great-aunt, cried in his own barn where he thought no one could see him because he knew he'd done something that couldn't be undone. She looked at Levi. We've both been raised on half a story. I don't think either family's telling is a lie, exactly. I think they're both true, and both incomplete, and everyone's been too proud for 20 years to put the two halves together. Levi was quiet for a long moment. You think that would fix it, putting the halves together? I don't know, Josephine said honestly, but I know it's the first true thing anyone's tried in 20 years, and I'd rather try something true than keep living inside something half-finished. Before we go on, I want to stop for just a moment. From the United States to Australia, from Canada to the United Kingdom, from Ireland to New Zealand, wherever you're listening tonight, thank you for riding along. If Levi and Josephine are keeping you good company, a like means more than you know. And tell me, what country are you listening from today? Drop it in the comments. Now let's get back, because two families are about to find out exactly how long a secret can hold before the ground underneath it gives way. It held through the autumn. It gave way in November, the way these things generally do, through an accident rather than a confession. Josephine's younger brother, Danny, 13 years old and possessed of the particular relentless curiosity that 13-year-old brothers specialize in, had noticed his sister riding out toward the creek more often than cattle work required, and dressing, on those particular mornings, with more attention than the work required either. He said nothing for 3 weeks, out of a mixture of loyalty and the private calculation that this information might be worth something later. Then, on a Sunday, riding the fence line himself on an errand for his father, he saw Josephine's horse tied outside the old line shack, and beside it, unmistakably, a horse he recognized as belonging to the Hartwell operation. He told his father that evening, not out of malice exactly, but because 13-year-old boys are not built to carry information of that weight without setting it down somewhere. And Michael Doyle received the news the way a man receives news that confirms his worst private fear about the world. He confronted Josephine before supper, in the kitchen, with Danny hovering in the doorway looking considerably less pleased with himself than he had expected to feel. "Is it true?" Michael said. Not a question, the way Levi's line about being a Hartwell had not been a question. A fact he needed confirmed before he could decide what to do with it. Josephine did not lie to her father. She had never once, in 23 years, found it useful. "Yes," she said. "I've been meeting Levi Hartwell since September." The kitchen went very still. Michael Doyle looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Josephine watched something move across his face that she had seen only once before, the day the bank had nearly called their note during a hard winter years earlier. The particular fear of a man watching something he'd spent his whole life protecting slip toward a danger he couldn't fully name. "A Hartwell," he said. "A person," Josephine said, "who happens to be a Hartwell. He pulled a calf out of the creek in September that would have drowned, on land that wasn't his, and he did it before he had time to remember he wasn't supposed to." She held her father's gaze. "I've spent my whole life believing what you taught me about that family, Papa. I'm not saying you were wrong about everything. I'm saying I've met one of them now, properly, for months, and he isn't what the stories made him." "The stories," Michael said, "are about what his family did to this one. The stories are about what happened 20 years before either of us was born," Josephine said. "I love you. I respect what you've built and what you've protected. But I'm not willing to spend my whole life at war with a man I've never met over a dam his grandfather built in a drought that killed his family's cattle, same as it nearly killed ours." She said it plainly, without heat, the way she said most things that mattered. "I'd like your blessing. I know I might not get it. But I wanted you to hear the truth from me before you heard a smaller version of it from Danny." Michael Doyle looked at his daughter for a long time, and then, without another word, walked out to the barn and did not come back to the house until well after dark. On the Hartwell side, the discovery came differently but landed with similar weight. Thomas Hartwell found out from a hand who'd seen Levi riding toward the creek too many mornings running and had, without much malice, mentioned it in passing at the feed store, where it reached Thomas within the day, the way all things eventually reached everyone, in a valley small enough that gossip functioned as a kind of postal service. He confronted Levi in the barn, the way Thomas Hartwell confronted everything, with his sleeves rolled up and his jaw set. "Josephine Doyle," Thomas said. "Yes," Levi said. He had decided, in the weeks since the calf, that when this conversation came, he was not going to soften it. "Since September." Thomas Hartwell stood very still. "You know what that family did to this one." "I know what your father told me about what that family did," Levi said. "I've heard the story of the dam 100 times. I've never once heard the part where their herd was dying same as ours was, and their grandfather built it out of the same fear yours would have felt in his place." He looked at his father directly, which he had rarely done on any subject that mattered. "I've spent every Sunday since September with Josephine Doyle, and she is not the enemy you raised me to expect. She's sharp, and she's honest, and she runs half that operation better than most men I know run a whole one, and I am not going to apologize for finding that I care about her. She's a Doyle." "She's a person," Levi said, echoing without knowing it the exact words Josephine had used on her own father that same evening. "Who happens to be a Doyle? I'd ask you to consider that those two facts aren't the same thing, even though you've spent 20 years treating them like they were." Thomas Hartwell said nothing for a long time. Then he turned and left the barn, the same way Michael Doyle had left his kitchen, and Levi stood alone with the horses and understood that he had just done the one thing his family had built its entire identity around, never doing. The two young people did not stop meeting. If anything, the discovery made the meetings more necessary, because now there was nothing left to protect by hiding, only something to protect by continuing. They met at the shack through the last weeks of autumn, while both households held their particular version of a cold, watchful silence, and they talked, more than once, about whether what they were building was worth the cost it was clearly going to demand. "I won't ask you to choose between me and your family," Levi said one evening, the lamp burning low, the first frost of the year visible through the shack's cracked window. "I know what that costs a person. I don't think love is supposed to cost you everything else you've ever had." "I'm not choosing between you and my family," Josephine said. "I'm choosing to believe that a family can survive being wrong about something for 20 years, if somebody's finally brave enough to say so out loud." She took his hand. "I don't think this has to be a choice, Levi. I think it's been treated like one for 2 decades because nobody wanted to do the harder thing, which is admit that the whole feud might have been a mistake from the very first summer. What broke the standoff, in the end, was not romance, it was drought, the same thing that had started the whole quarrel 2 decades before, arriving again in the spring of 1890 with a viciousness the valley hadn't seen in a generation. Miller's Creek, which had run thin in 1869 and started the original war, ran thinner still in the spring of 1890, and both the Hartwell and Doyle herds began, within the same difficult month, to feel the effects of water that simply wasn't enough to go around. It was Josephine who saw the solution first, because she had spent months, without either family fully realizing it, learning the details of both operations. Levi's, through their conversations at the shack, and her own, through the ledgers she'd kept since she was 17. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had studied both sides of a problem long enough to see past its old grievances, that the creek's flow, properly managed with a shared system rather than 2 competing claims, could support both herds through even a hard drought. The trouble had never really been the water. The trouble had been 20 years of 2 families refusing to manage it together. She brought the plan to Levi first, sketched out on paper with the same careful precision she brought to her father's books, and Levi looked at it and understood immediately that she had solved, on paper, in an evening, the problem that had defined both their families' lives since before either of them was born. "This would work," he said. "I know it would work," Josephine said. "The trouble isn't the plan. The trouble is that it requires your father and my father to sit in the same room and admit the fight was never really about the water at all. It was about pride, dressed up as water, for 20 years. They brought the plan to both fathers separately, on the same day, each one presenting it as their own idea rather than a shared one, because both of them understood, correctly, that neither man would accept a solution that arrived with the other family's fingerprints on it too visibly. Thomas Hartwell studied his son's proposal at the kitchen table for a long time, saying nothing, and Levi watched him do the arithmetic that mattered more than any of the old grievances, his herd, thinning by the week, against a plan that could save it, offered by a son he'd been furious with for months, and had never, in that fury, actually stopped loving. "Doyle would never agree to this," Thomas said finally. "He might," Levi said, "if you were the one to ask him. Not through Josephine, not through me. You, riding onto his land the way your father once rode onto it with a shotgun, except this time carrying something worth having instead." Thomas Hartwell sat with that for a long time. Then, on a Thursday morning in April, with his herd losing weight by the week and his pride weighing considerably less than it had in years, he rode onto Doyle land for the first time in 2 decades, unarmed, and found Michael Doyle on his porch, who watched him come with the same wary stillness his own father had watched Amos Hartwell with, 20 years before, from that same porch, holding a rifle he had chosen, that time too, not to use. "Hartwell," Michael Doyle said. "Doyle," Thomas said. He dismounted and stood at the base of the porch steps and did something his father had never once done in the entire history of the feud, which was ask permission before he came any further. "I'd like to come up and talk, if you'll let me." Michael Doyle looked at him for a long moment, the whole weight of 20 years and 2 children who had apparently decided the weight wasn't worth carrying anymore, sitting in the space between them. Then he set the rifle down against the porch rail, which was not quite forgiveness but was, unmistakably, a beginning. "Coffee's on," he said. "Come up." The 2 men talked for most of the morning. Thomas Hartwell told the version of the dam story he'd never told, the one where his own father had cried in the barn that night. Michael Doyle told the version he'd never told either, the one where Patrick Doyle had gone to his grave, regretting that he'd never once ridden over afterward to say he understood why Amos had torn it down, and would likely have done the same in his position. Both men discovered, over the course of a single pot of coffee, that they had spent 20 years fighting a war neither of their fathers had actually wanted to keep fighting, and that the only thing keeping it alive was the particular stubbornness of sons who inherited a grievance without ever once questioning whether their fathers had wanted it inherited at all. By noon, they had agreed to Josephine's plan for the creek. By the following week, engineers from Bozeman had been hired, jointly, to build the shared system she'd designed, a set of gates and a divided channel that would let both properties draw exactly what the drought allowed, without either family having to trust the other's word alone, the numbers themselves doing the trusting instead. And somewhere in the middle of that practical, unglamorous work of surveying water rights and splitting costs, Thomas Hartwell found himself standing beside Michael Doyle at the very spot where Amos Hartwell had once torn down a dam with his bare hands, and said, without much ceremony, that he thought their children had done something braver than either of the 2 men standing there had managed to do in 20 years. "They fell in love with the wrong family," Michael said, "and had the sense not to let that stop them." "Feels foolish now," Thomas said. 20 years of a fight that ended the first afternoon, 2 stubborn old men actually sat down and talked. "Most fights do," Michael said, "once somebody finally sits down." Levi and Josephine were married in June, at the line shack itself, which both families agreed, without much discussion, was the only possible place for it. The structure had been repaired for the occasion, patched and swept and hung with wildflowers by both households working side by side, an image that would have been unthinkable 8 months before, and now seemed, to everyone gathered, like the most natural thing in the valley. Danny, 13 and considerably more pleased with himself than he had any right to be, stood as the youngest witness and told anyone who'd listen for years afterward that he was the one who'd started the whole thing, which was, everyone agreed, not exactly false. Their daughter was born the following spring, and they named her Grace, a name that belonged to neither family specifically, a fresh start rather than an inherited one. Michael Doyle and Thomas Hartwell stood together at the christening, two old men who had spent 20 years unable to occupy the same room, now arguing amiably over which grandfather the baby's stubborn chin favored, and when Thomas Hartwell held his granddaughter for the first time, standing in the same kitchen where he'd once confronted his son with his sleeves rolled up, he found himself, to his own quiet surprise, crying the way his own father had once cried alone in a barn, except this time in front of everyone, and not from grief. On a morning in October, 3 years after the calf and the creek, Levi stood at the water's edge, watching the new shared channel run clean and full between both properties, the drought long past, the herds healthy on both sides for the first time in a generation. Josephine came down the bank with Grace on her hip, 2 years old, and already showing her mother's habit of studying things carefully before deciding what to make of them. "They still tell the old story in town," Josephine said. "The dam, the shotgun, 20 years of it." "Let them tell it," Levi said. "It's true, as far as it goes. It's just not the whole of it anymore." Josephine looked out at the creek, running the way it had always run, indifferent to feuds and reconciliations alike, simply doing what water does. "What's the whole of it, then?" Levi thought about a calf drowning on land that wasn't his, and a woman standing waist-deep, telling him to get in the water instead of standing there, deciding whether he was allowed to. "The whole of it," he said, "is that a fight can outlive every reason anyone ever had for starting it, and it takes exactly one person deciding not to inherit it anymore to end the whole thing. 20 years is a long time to be angry at people you've never actually spoken to. That's the part of this story worth sitting with. Two families spent 2 decades passing down a grievance like a family heirloom, polishing it, adding to it, teaching it to children who never chose it and never once questioned whether they were allowed to put it down. It took a drowning calf and 2 young people too stubborn to accept an inheritance they hadn't asked for. Most of the wars we carry aren't really about what we think they're about. They're about pride, wearing the costume of principle, grievance mistaken for identity, until somebody young enough or brave enough or simply tired enough finally asks the question nobody else was willing to ask: what if we just stopped? If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. You gave me something I never take lightly, your time and your attention. These stories only exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every person who shares an episode with someone who might need a quiet hour, that's what keeps this going. Wherever you are tonight, in the United States, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Australia, in Ireland, in New Zealand, I hope Levi and Josephine gave you something warm to carry. May God bless every single one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.